Welcome to Spot Check, the weekly video update series for The Greatest Unreality, a dissertation about Dungeons and Dragons. I'm Nick Miser. Before we get into the topic this week, a quick update on the Kickstarter. We're currently sitting just short of 50%, right as we're just over 50% of the way through the campaign. So that's actually a really good place to be. In Kickstarters, you have this middle period that it's the times that try men's souls, where the initial hype is over and the final push is yet to come. So we're kind of in that valley right now, which is why I would encourage anyone interested in the project to be sure you're sharing the link. Give links to this YouTube video so people can see what the project is all about. Give links to the Kickstarter. If you know anyone that's interested in the project or of a website that might be full of people interested in the project, I'm trying to hit as many websites as I can, but as we all know, the internet is a very large place full of lots of nooks and crannies that I will not find my way to, but I hope that you can if you're someone who's interested in the project and think you know some other people who might want to contribute. Okay, so last week we talked about how story is a central part of human life, how we're always making stories out of our daily lives, but that we have problems doing that sometimes because of all of the mundane details that come up and kind of distract us from the story that we feel that we're a part of, and so we lose that thread. We also talked about how storytelling as traditionally understood is a way of getting at the mythic and training us to see that in our everyday lives by kind of stripping away some of those contingent details, the mundane things, and letting us see the structure that's underneath in stories and then applying that to our everyday lives. And I ended by saying that there are some problems with storytelling, and that's that our ability to distill the mythic out of life is not an unqualified good. The ability to tell stories has been used for destructive ideologies as well as for good purposes, of course. You can see this in really concentrated forms like the Nazi application of myth. They were drawing on Wagner, who was drawing on mythology, or in more diffuse forms like pervasive advertising, the 24-hour news cycle. Sometimes mythologizing can do violence to reality rather than helping us to understand reality better. Now, we're not defenseless against this. We are often resisting the myths or the stories that are being told to us, but we're not invulnerable to them either. And that's why we have to understand this process of mythologizing, and that's why it's so important, so that we can experience what Max Weber, a sociologist, would call an enchanted world, one where we can experience wonder at the world around us and experience that story in that mythic dimension where we think about life in terms of its broader significances, but without being subject to delusion in the process. J.R.R. Tolkien, who himself was a great mythologizer, described it like this. He said, "Enchantment produces a secondary world into which both designer and spectator can enter, to the satisfaction of their senses while they are inside. But in its purity, it is artistic in desire and purpose. Uncorrupted, it does not seek delusion, not bewitchment and domination. It seeks shared enrichment, partners in making and delight, not slaves." We have this idea that we can allow ourselves to be put under the spell of storytelling without really falling for the enchantment and still being aware of the process. So where I want to go next and how we're going to get to D&D from here is to look at some fantasy authors in the early 20th century who started working on ways to move outside of the complete control that a storyteller normally has over the narrative as a way of moving it a little bit closer to the real world, in the sense that there are aspects of the real world that resist our storytelling, or at least seem to. So if you look at people like Fritz Leiber, who wrote the World of Lankmar series, he wrote that world based on a game that he was playing with his friend named Harry Otto Fisher, basically a game where they would make up this story together. Similarly, HP Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, and Clark Ashton Smith, kind of the three greats of American pulp fiction, played a similar sort of game where they're producing works in each other's worlds and creating references to the Necronomicon or other aspects of each other's worlds in each other's texts. And this creates kind of a shared mythic universe. The reason why this is important is that they're ceding some of the control that they would normally have over every aspect of this myth that they're creating to other people, taking it outside of their hands. And that moves it a little bit closer to the real world that resists our mythologizing efforts. Now, if you remember last week, I said that one way to think about what we're doing when we read stories or tell stories is kind of like weightlifting. We're training ourselves to identify the mythic that we then apply that training to our everyday lives. So if you look at the games that Lovecraft and Lieber and these people were playing, it's if following that analogy, it's like you're adding weights to the weightlifting process. It's getting heavier lifting to move those story pieces because other people are contributing and doing things that are outside of your control. And that helps us see the mythologizing process, because mythologizing in our everyday lives is always something that happens between people. Intersubjectively is what we would call it in social science, but it basically means it's something that we do together. It's not something that people do on their own. Meaning comes out of community. And so by modeling that process in their writing, the authors that I'm talking about were drawing on an aspect of how mythologizing works in the everyday lives and making that visible in their own process of myth making. And so if you've played D&D or any role-playing game at all, you can probably see where I'm going to be going with this next week, to look at the ways that D&D makes the process of mythologizing explicit and provides ways of creating resistance to myth making that makes us kind of have to work for the story, and that has some parallels and really useful effects in our everyday lives. So with that final claim, the foundation I'm trying to lay before really getting into talking to D&D about you is complete. We have the idea that the mythic is often difficult to see in everyday life. Story helps us experience that mythic dimension of life, but in so doing, it can also make us vulnerable to manipulation. So one tactic for shoring up this vulnerability comes through gaming the storytelling process. And that's what I think that becomes really explicit in Dungeons & Dragons. And so next week I'm going to talk about that and about differing ideas about story that developed in the history of gaming, including Dragonlance, which is really notorious or really lauded for moving forward or at least changing how story worked in the history of the game. Thanks again for watching. Be sure to keep updated on the Kickstarter page and on Facebook to see any updates that come on in the next week or so.